Thank you, Michelle. When she first laid out for me that structure of how she was going to present that information, it really grabbed me. I thought that is just such a fantastic way to organize how to think about humans on the landscape. So I really appreciated that talk. Next up is we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into historic range of variability, natural range of variability. So what point in time should we be managing our landscapes for? It's kind of the million-dollar question, right? And should we be managing it into the future? Forget about the past. So a couple of folks are going to give that sort of talk to us this morning. Summer Kemp Jennings is a Forest Service ecologist. She sits down on the Umpqua National Forest. And Tom DeMeo, who's our regional ecologist, will also be talking about this, I think in turn, tag teaming, right?
Yes.
So Summer is going to go first. Please help me welcome Summer to the stage.
All right, thank you. So Jessica Hudek couldn't be here today, so she asked me to stand in and give her presentation for her. So I get to give the presentation to hundreds of people, so lucky me. All right, here we go. Hold my beverage. So really what I'm going to do is just define some terminology, give some background on natural range of variability, talk about some of the pros and cons for using natural range of variability in land management planning, and ultimately really just be an advocate for the use of clear and concise language. So before I can talk about the applications and really why we care about natural range of variability, let's just go ahead and define it. So Landry's and others said that natural range of variability refers to the ecological conditions and the spatial and temporal variation in these conditions that are relatively unaffected by people within a period of time and geographical area appropriate to an expressed goal. Woof. That's a lot, and there's a lot of room for interpretation in that. So one of the questions we can ask is just, what is natural? Are the impacts of Native Americans natural? What is the appropriate spatial and temporal scale to apply to natural range of variability? So lots of questions here, and really, the other question is, when is the point in time when our systems were relatively unaffected by people? And ultimately, the answer to these questions, a lot of it is just depending on that last part. So an expressed goal or our objective. So you may have also heard historic range of variability and future range of variability. So historic range of variability is often used interchangeably with natural range of variability. Historic range of variability specifically refers to a time in the past, obviously, where natural range of variability, it can include current or future conditions, but for the most part, natural range of variability is also talking about a time in the past. And in this presentation, I will use HRV and NRV interchangeably. Future range of variability, or FRV, is obviously referring to an estimated range of some ecological conditions or processes that are occurring in sometime in the future. The use of future range of variability is especially relevant when the effects of anthropogenic stressors are high. So climate change, fire suppression, invasive species, human development patterns. So when these are high, and therefore it likely results in the system moving farther away from its historic range of variability. We may also have heard phrases like the current natural range of variability or future natural range of variability, and ultimately the inconsistent usage of these terms and just the whole number of these terms really makes it difficult for us to keep track of each other's thoughts, and even more difficult for outside parties like collaborators and the public, especially when reading our planning documents, to keep track of our thoughts. So which brings me to our planning documents. So a lot of what we're talking about in our planning documents is ultimately the past, the present, and the future. So that sounds pretty simple. However, when we're talking about the past, we can call that maybe the historic condition, the reference condition, pre-settlement condition, analog condition, and all of these can be an undesired or a desired condition. So same thing with the present. We can call that our current condition, reference condition, post-settlement condition, disturbed condition, and this can be desired or undesired. And again, same thing with the future. Several words there to describe it. So disturbed condition, non-analog condition, maybe an unknown condition, and again, these can all be desired or undesired. And then you layer on top of all of those terms things like resistance, resilience, and restoration, all of which have an inherent temporal association with them. So really, that leads to a lot of different layers of the onion and a lot of different room for interpretation. So it's really important to remember that the meaning of each of these is really relative and situational. So the more precise and clear our use of language becomes, the fewer the number of the possible interpretations for a message, and ultimately the more likely that our argument will stand up in the case of litigation. So obviously there's a myriad of different terms out there. So let's find a way to use them for clarity rather than confusion. So let's pick a term, let's define it, and let's use it consistently. So now maybe you're confused or scared or just wondering, like, why here, why now? Why would we ever consider these things? Because it's just a huge amount of interpretation and gray area. So really, our current agency direction relies heavily on historic range of variation and current departure concepts. In addition, the 2012 planning rule uses range of variability terminology. And so it's really important that we understand it and use it appropriately. It's also important to acknowledge that it's sometimes not even possible to recreate reference conditions given climatic, cultural, or ecological changes that have occurred. Also, it may not be acceptable socially, politically, or economically. And while desired future condition of restoration work looks to natural range of variability, other types of forest management may not. So for example, areas that focus on social, economic, or maybe specific species and habitat goals may not look to natural range of variability. And again, the use of historic range of variability and current departure does not suggest that our management goal should be to recreate all of those ecological conditions, or that those ecological conditions were preferable. So when we do use one of these terms, it's important to state if we're using it simply for greater context or because it's one of our objectives. So obviously, there are some arguments for using natural range of variability and some arguments against using natural range of variability. So one argument against using natural range of variability in land management planning is that a description of past patterns and processes is irrelevant today or in the future because all of our systems are so extensively altered. We're not just going to stop altering our systems. So why would we look to this? Again, another argument against is that each point in time and space is unique. So why would we manage to a point in time and to a past point in time and space? And similarly, Climate patterns are continually changing, so why would we manage to conditions created by a past climate? Some justifications for using natural range of variability in our planning. Ultimately, it yields insight into why and how current conditions developed, and what changes we might expect in the future. Also, that maybe it's not an attempt to mimic the processes that occurred on a site long ago, but to improve our understanding about the context of the area and the landscape scale effects of disturbance at that area. Also, it can help prescribe future conditions that are more relevant, variable, and ecologically sustainable. So there are some acknowledged limits of using natural range of variability. So first of all, more often than not, we have a lack of site-specific data that really forces us to rely on an extrapolation from other areas and expert opinion to fill our knowledge gaps. Similarly, we usually have an insufficient temporal depth of data that precludes reconstruction of historical conditions over a sufficiently long reference period to capture the variability, and also inhibits us from projecting future conditions very well. We may have a lack of information about spatial variability that's resulting from a lack of confidence in spatial configurations and severity of historical disturbances. So the take home here is that range of variability really must be interpreted within the scopes and limitations of our data sources. And if we're going to use it, we should really state the scope, we should really state those limitations. So in contrast, there's also some strengths in using natural range of variability. So first of all, just using all of the data sources available to us for a defined landscape can give a lot of insight into vegetation patterns of the past and the potential disturbance and climate patterns that created those vegetation patterns. From this, we can estimate how departed we are from a reference period, and ultimately, historic range of variability is really one of our best tools at this time for understanding what works at a site and what might be sustainable. So in review, natural range of variability is the ecological conditions and the spatial and temporal variation in these conditions that are relatively unaffected by people within a period of time and geographical area appropriate to an expressed goal. And historic range of variability is simply natural range of variability when the reference period is prior to what defines current conditions. Typically, this is pre-European settlement. And future range of variability is an estimated range of some ecological condition or process that may occur in this future, especially relevant when the effects of anthropogenic stressors are high. I just want to mention here that using future range of variability is gaining a lot of popularity because most places our anthropogenic stressors are high. But we have to be cautious when using future range of variability because estimating the future is even more uncertain than estimating the past. In addition, the appropriate use of these terms really depends on the situation. So we should ask ourselves, are we talking about the past, the present, or the future, a reference condition, or a desired condition? Let's go ahead and define these terms when we're using them and state the assumptions and limitations. So let's pick a term, let's define it, and let's use it consistently. Let's also make sure that our associated terms are used appropriately and defined to limit confusion. So really, the take home here, I think, is that the agency is building these somewhat intricate concepts into our planning documents, and in doing so, is really accepting the responsibility for the appropriate use of these terms and the accurate usage of them. And I really think that we as land managers are the bearer of this responsibility. All right, let's go Tom.